Helen, welcome to The World Today. I'm Millicent Walker. First, the headlines. Russia's foreign minister claims 3 men sentenced to death, 2 Britons and 1 Moroccan, committed crimes in a breakaway Ukrainian region. EU Parliament approves ban on new fossil fuel cars from 2035. And graphic testimony as former US President Donald Trump accused of coup attempt. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has hailed British leadership and its assistance for Kyiv against Russia's invasion during talks today with British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace in the Ukrainian capital. Mr. Wallace visiting Kyiv 2 months after Prime Minister Boris Johnson praised Mr. Zelensky for his own leadership during a war in which Britain has provided Ukraine with weapons and financial assistance and has imposed sanctions on Russia. He visited Kyiv a day after 2 Britons and a Moroccan were sentenced to death by a court in the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic, whose separatist leaders are backed by Moscow after being captured while fighting for Ukraine.
You're also trendy. You have the most trendy defence minister in Europe.
Of course, and for me.
You absolutely do.
Yes, I know.
I had a state.
How are you?
I'm General Elvis, comes from Chief Operations Staff, my miniature assistant, Colonel Hall, who's worked with me before. So.
Good to see you. How are we?
You're doing an amazing.
We do together.
Yeah, well, no, you, Mr. President, and your people. I mean,
people are the first.
Yeah. That's the dividing line between us and Russia.
In the meantime, Ukrainian president has said Russia has violated about 400 different international treaties. Speaking to the 2022 Copenhagen Democracy Summit by video link, the Ukrainian leader said only during Russia's war against Ukraine and that he wants to remind them that it started in 2014, not on the 24th of February 2022. He said Russia has violated about 400 different international treaties to which their countries are parties. The president gave numerous examples of treaties he claimed Russia had violated, including the UN Charter. He said people should recall the Budapest Memorandum, claiming Russia has added maximum cynicism to the whole picture by violating it. It says with this violation, Russia has put an end to the whole struggle for nuclear disarmament in the world. The Budapest Memorandum was an agreement in 1994 in which Ukraine would give up the nuclear weapons that it had inherited from the Soviet era in exchange for assurances about its future security agreed by Russia, the US and Britain. And the European Parliament, the EU's Parliament, says it supports Ukraine's bid to achieve candidate status to join the European Union. The Parliament's President, Roberta Metsola, said this today at the Copenhagen Democracy Summit. Speaking earlier, Zelensky, of course, said words were not enough and action was needed to make Ukraine part of the European family. He formally also submitted a completed questionnaire on European Union membership, April the 18th. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen handed the questionnaire to Zelensky during a visit to Kyiv April 8, pledging a speedier start to Ukraine's bid to become a member of the EU. This is following Russia's invasion of the country.
On European ambitions, I get asked this by every journalist I meet. Ukraine is already part of our European family, but it is high time that it is also given the real opportunity to join our European project. This is about hope. This is about an acknowledgement of the price that Ukraine has been forced to pay. And it is as much about strengthening Europe as it is about strengthening Ukraine. So let me be clear. The European Parliament, which I have the honor and responsibility to preside, stands firmly behind Ukraine's bid to receive EU candidate status.
VOA's Anna Chernikova joins us now from Kyiv. Anna, good to see you. Anna, talk to us about what we're hearing. Russia has said that the death sentence applicable to the Britons and, of course, the Moroccan. I think he was saying that, the UK was being hysterical about its response, but it was also sort of hinted at more strikes to come. What are you hearing?
Good evening. Well, it's of course. I think that we cannot just be silent with this kind of accusations by basically the judgment of a state which is not recognized. So of course it's it's something that everyone should stand for and try to appeal, because death sentence by the unrecognized country, well, not even country, like a state, it's something that could not happen in 21st century and could not happen in Europe, it just could not happen anywhere. So what we are hearing here is that, of course, it's something which is not going under any law. It's something which is not going under any international law, especially, and under any treaties, and especially under the war treaties. So we just hope that these international citizens would be exchanged at one point, and I think this is something which will be negotiated. At least this is. Somehow this is what it is the feeling of, because we don't really have a certain, official wide response, because this is just, as I already said, this is just goes beyond any laws and any treaties. So we will hope that this would be discussed on the highest level, and these international citizens would be just exchanged and return to Ukraine, and then to return to their own countries.
And also, we understand the Ukraine definitely wants European status, and we also know that the Ukrainian president had also said he was going to soft pedal on joining NATO. And one wonders what happens now. This is, between both countries. Are they moving ahead to talks in ways that, Russia can put an end to this invasion? What will happen? But perhaps before you talk about that, let's go to the east, Severodonetsk especially. We heard from analysts that in 2 weeks, Russia might liberate that place. Now, on the other hand, Russian troops are expecting arms and ammunition, from US and its allies. Has it gotten any, and what does it look like there on the front lines?
Well, the situation in Severodonetsk in particular remains extremely difficult, remains extremely, hard to easily explain, in terms of logic or in terms of any tactics, because what Russian forces are doing basically is just, removing this place from the map and just destroying everything which is there. Like, for example, today we got information that one of the main arenas in Severodonetsk, where all the sport events were happening, all the cultural events were happening, and this was basically the symbol of Severodonetsk, it was destroyed by Russian forces. And this is something that just proves that Russia do not plan to keep the city, for living, and just plan to capture the territory, because they need territory to go on. So basically, it's not about capturing the town; it's about capturing a territory, a land, and that's it. We hear a lot that Ukrainian forces are doing a great job of defense. We're hearing a lot that Ukrainian forces are doing a great, tactic moves, because, for example, we know from the military officials, that in terms of artillery equipment, artillery system, and ammunition, Ukrainians are at certain point are 1 to 10 if we compare to Russian side. So Russians have much more of all these artillery systems in that particular area. And Ukrainians, what they do, and this is what we have, like, it's confirmed statistics, that Ukrainian forces are trying to get Russians into the streets, to get into the street fights, because street fights is something that Russian forces are not very successful at, and Ukrainians are trying to beat them and try to destroy as much manpower as they can in order to, neglect this artillery, like difference in artillery numbers that both sides have. So Severodonetsk, the turn there could be very different, and at least this is what we can tell for the moment, and it's difficult, to predict. Some people say, and some experts say, that Ukrainians might take it over. Some people say that Russians would actually succeed. But again, what we clearly see that this battle is happening now for a very long time, and this is definitely not what Russians were planning, because Russians wanted to capture this town as fast as possible, and definitely not, spending there so many weeks and even months. So we will see. Situation, as I already said, remains extremely difficult, and this remains the center of battlefield for the moment. If we look at the other parts of the front line, in general, situation at Donetsk region and Luhansk region is very, very complicated, and very heavy fightings are going on. We should not forget that Kharkiv region and the city of Kharkiv itself remains also under great danger, because a lot of shelling is happening, people are dying, and unfortunately civilians are suffering and losing their homes. But yes, we should concentrate still on, unfortunately, we cannot, I don't want to say that Kharkiv region or Kharkiv city is less important, but we should understand that main forces are now concentrated from both sides, are now concentrated in Luhansk and Donetsk region. If we come back to your first question in terms of EU integration and membership candidacy that Ukraine is waiting for, well, this is one of the most important questions now for Ukraine in this, upcoming weeks. So, of course, Ukraine expects to get this status of the candidate to the EU, and we know that today we had certain information that there are a couple of countries which don't want to support this decision. We know exactly that which countries will support. What we hear from the official, comments from different leaders of different countries. But of course, as President Zelensky already mentioned a lot of times, and Ukrainian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that Ukraine is fighting for the future and for the peace in Europe, in the world, and Ukraine is basically has already proved that all the standards and all the aims of civilized European society are also here in Ukraine, and we're fighting for these values. And so, of course, Ukraine is expecting that this would be a positive decision. At least a lot of things have already started to change in the country, even despite the war, and especially in the military sector. During the war, it was a huge reform, which is going in parallel with the war itself. So, we'll see. It's very important, step by the European countries, and it's important. I think it's quite a historical step. So we will see how it's going to turn. Very interesting. Indeed. What's going to happen.
Very true. Anna, continue to stay safe. Thanks so much, VOA's Anna Chenikova joining us there from Kyiv.
Thank you.
And the UN Human Rights Office, OHCHR, said that it was concerned about the situation of 3 foreigners who were captured while fighting for Ukraine and have been sentenced to death in one of Russia's proxies in eastern Ukraine. 2 Britons and Moroccan received a death sentence Thursday from a court in the self-proclaimed Donetsk People's Republic.
Your Honour, I misunderstood. There was a misunderstanding. I was confused, and I want to take away my not guilty and change it to guilty.
That is one of the Britons, his response when he's been asked questions there. But of course, the Russian fast food chain McDonald's, that was formerly McDonald's in the country, has revealed its new logo as it prepares to reopen its restaurants from Sunday. The new branding features a circle, 2 lines, which are set to represent a burger and 2 French fries. Let's talk to security analyst Temitope Olodo, who joins us now for more on what's really happening in Ukraine. Thanks for joining us on the program. I mean, what do you make of, where we are with the invasion of Ukraine? What's your take on the outlook?
The outlook is definitely brink. It's unfortunate that many people have lost their life. A lot of resources, unnecessary resources have been lost. And as a result of this war, the world has been plunged into a food security crisis. So there is a lot of loss that has come out as a result of this war. Where are we going? That is a $1 million question, because this war will not be ended by the physical war, and it will not be ended by negotiation. It will be ended by the mindset of Putin, President Putin, because it's what President Putin is thinking, or is thinking, that will determine when this war will end. Because we know from his rhetoric and from things that he has said in the past, that anybody that supports Ukraine will help him, will embolden him the more to destroy Ukraine. Because if you actually want to capture a place and keep it for yourself, then you don't need to destroy it. But what he's doing literally is actually destroying Ukraine, destroying the infrastructure, destroying almost everything about Ukraine, their culture, their schools, their hospital. That would take loads of millions of pounds or dollars to reconstruct and get Ukraine back to where it was prior to the crisis. So for me and for many analysts that are looking at it, understanding the mindset of Putin is the beginning of understanding when this war will end.
And, we're seeing a lot of comments, a lot of reactions to the Britons who have been sentenced by the Russia separatist region, also the Moroccan. But we know before this, Ukraine had sentenced a 21-year-old Russian, Vermin Shishimarin, I believe, as well. I mean, what kind of rules apply now in this war? Is there justice to it?
There's a lot of injustice that is going on. Whether we like it or not, a lot of injustice have gone on since the beginning of this war. And many Nigerians that are watching us right now will remember the horror of seeing a lot of Black people being prevented from getting on the train. That is also, they are also casualty of this dirty and unfortunate war that is going and that is ongoing. So there are a lot of people are victims of it. But in terms of the Geneva Convention, it is very, very clear about how a prisoner of war should be treated. And under that standard, the current situation with the British citizen and the Moroccan cannot be said to fall within the remit of that law. So, and that's the reason why I know that the UK Minister of Foreign Affairs has spoken to our counterpart, and in strong terms made it very clear that they are not happy with the proxy approach adopted by the Russians. Because the belief of the British is that the Russians are actually indirectly at the fingers behind, pointing the buttons with regard to how these individuals should be treated. So my hope, and just like your previous guest, is that this issue will be dealt with politically, and that those individuals will be exchanged one way or the other, either by Ukraine, because Britain will want to maintain their stance, like they're not doing that exchange. But definitely Ukraine might come to the aid of the British, because the British population have actually been quite helpful to the Ukrainians. So it would be quite good if the Ukrainians could actually throw a bone and say, actually, because the British have been very supportive of us, we are willing to exchange some of the prisoners in exchange. That will actually swell up the support they get here in the UK and across Europe.
We always appreciate your time on the program. Security analyst Temitope Olodo, thanks for joining us on the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Still ahead on The World Today. Fight against climate change is also a fight for the right to education of girls, as Nobel Peace Prize laureate Malala Yousafzai joins a climate protest. Please stay with us. Welcome back. And participants from across the African continent have met virtually, joined by the Special Envoy for Global Food Security, head of the Office of Sanctions Coordination, with the theme Global Food Security, especially as it impacts Africa. This special briefing, organized by the U.S. Department of State's Africa's Regional Media Hub, says it is working with African countries and institutions, farming organizations to try to build food security and resilience into African food systems. Take a look. The world has faced food crises before, but the situation in Ukraine is pushing about 40 million additional people into the ranks of the food insecure. In an online briefing with Special Envoy for Global Food Security, Dr. Carrie Fowler said it's a multi-causal situation coupled with climate change, other conflict, and COVID.
The majority of countries in the world are net food.
The Kremlin maintains that sanctions must be lifted for Russian grains to reach markets. But the head of the Office of Sanctions Coordination says there's nothing stopping Russia from exporting its food and fertilizer, except decisions Russia has made.
The U.S. does not sanction Russian food and fertilizer. And we can discuss what some people are saying about this, but we do not. Our European colleagues are not restricting Russian exports to the global south. They have some limitations on importing Russian food and fertilizer into their own territories. So the story that the sanctions are causing the problem, I think, is deeply misleading.
Ukraine is one of the world's major grain producers, and according to the US, Russia has disrupted one of the most productive ways that countries receive grain.
Ukraine used to export 6 million or so tons of grain a month, mostly to the global south. And now that has had to stop. In March and April, it was very small. With our European partners, we're working very hard to get out as much grain as possible. But at best, it will probably be about half what was before.
During the question and answer session with journalists, both men responded to the allegations that Russia is stealing grains from Ukraine and selling to its friendly neighbors. They also spoke about the impact of the crisis on Africa.
Africa started out prior to the Russian invasion of the Ukraine in probably the weakest position of any continent. Probably 70% of the food that's produced in Africa stays in Africa. And those two facts tell you two things. One is you really need trade to flow. You need food to flow between countries, and that any small disturbance in the global food system can cause ripple effects. And the ripple effects are felt, I'm sorry to say, most dramatically in Africa.
Russia, we believe, has stolen several 100,000 tons of grain from Ukraine and then sent it out on small ships from Russian ports. Now, that grain has ended up with Russia's friends. So it chose politically to deliver this grain to places that are friendly. It's grain that in a normal year would have gone to Egypt, would have gone to Lebanon, would have gone maybe to Iran, into China. That's typically where Ukraine sends this grain at this time of year. And yet Russia decided to divert it and to profiteer by selling it at high prices.
One thing is certain, there is a global food crisis, hence the need for more engagement in boosting food production in developing countries, and particularly in Africa, while the situation in Ukraine needs to be resolved quickly. And EU lawmakers voted to ban the sale of petrol cars by 2035 this week as part of its plan to reduce its carbon emissions by more than 50% by 2030. MEPs backed a plenary vote Wednesday for zero-emission road mobility by 2035, essentially meaning no more diesel and petrol-fueled vehicles on the road. The ambitious target means the automotive battery industry will have to service a much larger demand over the coming years, and electric car makers stand to benefit hugely. That is, if they can source the requisite semiconductors and batteries. Lawmakers, including Netherlands MEP Jan Hatema, who led the group, overwhelmingly voted for the revised emission standards, 339 votes for 249 against and 24 abstentions. Let's head to Berlin now, where Chiponda Chimbelo, Deutsche Welle correspondent, joins us now for more. Hi, Chip. What does this mean for the bloc's climate change goals?
Well, the EU is actually the world's third biggest carbon emitter after China and the United States. And this could potentially help drastically reduce carbon emissions. And it could actually potentially take carbon emissions down to the level they were at in 1990. And this, of course, part of a wider plan to reduce carbon emissions by 55% by 2050. So this is obviously something that is being widely discussed, but it's, of course, right now a talking point, a basis on which the EU 27 governments can actually talk about the bloc's climate change measures. So it's not binding at this point, but this will serve as the basis for governments to come out and say what they really think about what the EU Parliament has decided. In terms of what is being discussed here in Germany, the Environment Ministry is, of course, in favor of this decision. They've already made that point. They said it before in March, but there are some, other opinions in the country, especially from the opposition, but also even within the government itself. We've heard from the transportation minister, who mentioned that actually he takes issue with the decision at this point because it doesn't exclude cars, combustion engine vehicles that run on synthetic fuels. Now, synthetic fuels can potentially be made in a way that they are actually carbon neutral. And that's why the transportation minister has come out and said that. So obviously, even within the German government itself, there are some, considerations about the decision at this point. But we will see exactly what they think in the coming weeks and months, and of course also from other EU governments. So it will be interesting to watch this discussion.
And how has the decision been received by the auto industry?
Well, the auto industry, of course, will be very much impacted by this decision. And in fact, Germany's auto industry accounts for around 800,000 jobs. The industry representatives have been saying that this decision from the EU will thwart innovation, and it will also reduce choices for customers. So the industry is, of course, extremely concerned about this decision because obviously it could be potentially hurtful in terms of what it does to the industry's bottom line. And of course, they've said that. But in terms of brands themselves, we've heard from the biggest brands here in Germany, Volkswagen and Mercedes, saying that they are ready to stop producing combustion engine vehicles by 2030. So 5 years before that actually needs to potentially go into effect. And they've said that we're ready, but they just don't think that the infrastructure is there to have the whole country running having new vehicles running on electricity, essentially, and there's just not enough charging stations to do that. And that is the problem. Between now and 2030, there's a huge gap. We have around 60,000 charging stations in Germany right now, and we might need as many as 1 million by 2030. So that's also a huge gap that needs to be covered in terms of infrastructure. And that's something they're, of course, really concerned about because, of course, having the infrastructure can help increase acceptance for electric vehicles. And that would be something, of course, that would help, accelerate the rate at which we stop using combustion engine vehicles.
So we've spoken about the bloc's climate goals, we've spoken about the auto industry, but what about the car drivers? I mean, this would mean
Well, of
phasing
course,
out.
for car drivers, this is, of course, going to be a major issue as well. People just don't like to be forced to change their behaviors. And that is something that, of course, that we know from research and environmental issues, climate change issues are extremely emotional and polarizing. And this is why this issue will, of course, in terms of car drivers, polarize them as well. We've had polls which have shown, like a few months ago, there was one poll showing that 49% of German car drivers were against banning combustion engine vehicles and 41% were in favor. So obviously, it seems to be that more German car drivers are actually against the ban of combustion engine vehicles. Now, that might also be related to the fact that we just don't have the infrastructure at this point. Like I mentioned, they have, a gap between, so right now we have 60,000 charging stations in Germany, but we might need as many as 1 million by 2030. So that's a huge gap. The more charging stations we have in the country, the easier it is for people to maybe take on this technology of using electric cars going forward. So that's part of it. Just the acceptance is just not there where it needs to be because, of course, of the lack of charging stations, but also, of course, because of the cost of electric vehicles. They are super expensive for most people. If you look at a Tesla, it's just out of reach for someone who drives a much cheaper vehicle, and that is the reality. And so it depends on where we stand in the coming years in terms of how much acceptance we get from car drivers.
Thank you, Chiponda, Deutsche Welle correspondent Chiponda Chibelude, joining us from Berlin. We're staying with climate change to fight against it. It's also a fight for the right to education of girls, millions of whom lose access to schools due to climate-related events. Now, that's according to Nobel Peace Prize laureate Malala Yousafzai. Well, she was speaking outside the Swedish Parliament, where she joined environmental campaigners Greta Thunberg, Vanessa Nakete at one of today's climate protests, which have been held there every week since 2018 and sparked a global movement. In 2012, the now 24-year-old survived being shot in the head by a Pakistani Taliban gunman after she was targeted for her campaign against the Taliban's efforts to deny women education. She subsequently became the youngest recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize for her education advocacy.
Due to climate-related events, millions of girls lose their access to schools. Events like droughts and floods impact schools directly. Displacements are caused due to some of these events, and because of that, girls are impacted the most. They're the first ones to drop out of schools and then the last ones to return as well. And we know that there is not enough effort put into solving these problems, and oftentimes in these situations, girls are never able to return to their schools. When they are stuck at home, they're more likely to be busy in the household chores. They are also expected to help their family members and less likely to have access to the tools and the facilities to continue their education. The Taliban and their de facto government are continuing to find excuses to stop girls from school, and we know that when girls do not have access to education, it can worsen the climate-related events. And Fridays for Future was also very active in Afghanistan as well. There were young activists who were supporting the causes. They were highlighting how there was pollution in their communities, how they were also impacted by the climate-related events, and they were also highlighting that even though Afghanistan was contributing the least to climate change, they were also receiving the worst of its impacts.
And rescuers have pulled out a woman from a landslide site and evacuated 11 factory workers from flood in 2 separate rescue operations in South China's Guangdong after heavy rain drenched parts of the province in the past 2 days. A rain-triggered landslide hit Qingyi County of Maoming City, burying several residents in mud and debris. Firefighters rushed to the site and used a wooden board to cover a trapped woman before digging by hand through the mud to free her. After a 30-minute operation, the woman was pulled out and sent to hospital for treatment. Also, a massive flood hit Shuihai City, with water reaching nearly 1 meter deep in some places, trapping 11 workers from a local factory. Firefighters were dispatched to the site and reached the workers by rubber boat. All 11 workers were brought to safety after 2 hours of the evacuation operation. Into the United States, where former U.S. President Donald Trump orchestrated last year's Capitol riots in an attempted coup. A congressional inquiry has heard as a hearing opened into the raid. Liz Cheney, the Republican vice chair of the committee, said Mr. Trump had lit the flame of this attack. Benny Thompson, a Democrat, said the riots endangered American democracy. Trump supporters stormed Congress the 6th of January 2021 as lawmakers met to certify Joe Biden's election victory. After almost a year of investigation, the Democrat-led U.S. House of Representatives Select Committee opened Thursday evening by showing clips from interviews it conducted with members of Mr. Trump's inner circle. Still in the United States, a gunman opened fire on his co-workers at a manufacturing facility in northern Maryland, killing multiple people before being taken into custody after a shootout with police. This happened yesterday. Washington County Sheriff Douglas Mullendore did not immediately identify the 23-year-old assailant, but told a news conference a state trooper stopped him as he was trying to flee. The sheriff said they were both taken to a local hospital for treatment of gunshot wounds. He added the shooter used a semi-automatic pistol handgun, but would not give details on the possible motives behind the attack. A company spokesperson said they were cooperating with authorities on the investigation and declined to further comment. And coming up on the program, researchers reveal secret find of 340-year-old sunken royal warship. I'll tell you more in a moment. And we're still in the United States as we go back to our story on the congressional hearing into the attack on the U.S. Capitol by supporters of Donald Trump trying to overturn his 2020 election defeat, presenting a testimony on Thursday. It was a timing that was geared to reach huge evening TV audiences across the United States. Here's more in this report.
The Congressional Committee investigating the U.S. Capitol riots kicked off public hearings on Thursday with graphic video and chilling testimony from witnesses laying out a case against former Republican President Donald Trump. The Democratic-led committee presented videotaped testimony showing that close Trump allies, including his own daughter Ivanka, rejected his false 2022 election fraud claims.
Donald Trump lost the presidential election in 2020.
Capitol Police Officer Caroline Edwards was one of the two in-person witnesses who testified on Thursday, the first of 6 congressional hearings intended to illustrate how Mr. Trump's repeated claims of voter fraud incited the deadly riot by his supporters on January the 6th. She described hours of grueling hand-to-hand combats with Trump supporters who barged into the Capitol that day.
When I fell behind that line, and I can just remember my breath catching in my throat because what I saw was just a war scene. It was something like I'd seen out of the movies. I couldn't believe my eyes. There were officers on the ground, you know, they were bleeding, they were throwing up, they were, you know, they had, I saw friends with blood all over their faces. I was slipping in people's blood. You know, I was catching people as they fell. It was carnage, it was chaos. I can't even describe what I saw. Never in my wildest dreams did I think that as a police officer, as a law enforcement officer, I would find myself in the middle of a battle. You know, I'm trained to detain, a couple of subjects and handle a crowd, but I'm not combat trained.
The committee also screened part of Mr. Trump's incendiary speech immediately before the attack, in which he redirected his supporters' anger at Vice President Mike Pence, who was at the Capitol that day overseeing the congressional certification of Mr. Joe Biden's election win. The committee further showed how even some of the people closest to the former president did not believe or support his voter fraud claims, including former Attorney General William Barr and Trump's daughter and advisor Ivanka.
I didn't want to be a part of it, and that's one of the reasons that went into me deciding to leave when I did. I observed, I think it was on December 1st, that how can you can't live in a world where the incumbent administration stays in power based on its view, unsupported by specific evidence, that there was fraud in the election.
I respect Attorney General Barr, so I accepted what he was saying.
Representative Liz Cheney, one of the two Republicans of the committee, also noted the multiple Republican congressmen later sought pardons from the White House for what she said was their role in trying to overturn the election. Meanwhile, Mr. Trump, who is considering another White House run in 2024, lashed out at the committee of, quote, political hacks after Thursday's hearing and stood by his voter fraud claims. 4 people were killed during the January 6 riots, which also caused millions of dollars in damage at the Capitol. More than 100 police officers were injured, while 1 officer died the following day.
The defense chiefs of China and the United States have held face-to-face talks for the first time in Singapore today, with both sides standing firm on their opposing views over Taiwan's right to rule itself. U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Chinese Minister of National Defense General Wei Feng met for nearly an hour, double the time initially allotted for the meeting. Wei said the talks went smoothly when questioned by a journalist as he left the meeting. A Chinese Defense Ministry spokesman later said Wei reiterated Beijing's firm stance in Taiwan, which is that it is part of China. Austin called on China to refrain from further destabilizing actions on Taiwan, a U.S. statement issued after the talks said. The pair met on the sidelines of the Shangri-La Dialogue, which attracts top-level military officials, diplomats, weapons makers from around the globe, and will take place from, of course, the 10th to the 12th of June. IAEA Chief Rafael Grossi says Iran dealt a near-fatal blow to chances of reviving the 2015 Iran nuclear deal as it began removing essentially all the International Atomic Energy Agency monitoring equipment installed under the deal. Iran had warned of retaliation if the IAEA's 35-nation Board of Governors passed a resolution drafted by the US, France, Britain and Germany criticizing Tehran for its continued failure to explain uranium traces found at undeclared sites.
In view of the latest information. 27 cameras like this. You remember in December we were showing these cameras on a more auspicious time where we were reinstalling cameras. 27 cameras are being removed in Iran, apart from an online enrichment monitoring system that we have over there. This, of course, poses a serious challenge to our ability to continue working there and to confirm the correctness of Iran's declaration under JCPOA. What we are seeing is because of the decision that is been announced to us today, is a decrease of the visibility that the agency is going to have about what's happening in Iran. And of course, this is something I deplore.
And leaders of Australia and New Zealand are vowing to take their ties to a new level through greater collaboration on regional security and also climate change. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said the two countries shared concerns about the Pacific as China pushes to expand its influence in the region. New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, the first foreign leader to visit Australia since its election, welcomed Australia's new stand on climate, adding the election win signalled an opportunity for a reset of their relations.
Determined to take trans-Tasman relations to a new level of cooperation in the mutual interests of both of our nations.
Climate change is a global issue, one that is writ large in our region, and we are very eager to work alongside our Pacific partners on this significant threat, the number one threat in the eyes of our Pacific neighbours in our region.
We're in lockstep on the Pacific, and I look forward to working with Prime Minister Ardern, working with our democratic neighbours. We're all a part of the Pacific. They're our partners, and at the Pacific Island Forum, I very much look forward to working not just with New Zealand, but our other Pacific partners on making sure that we defend national sovereignty.
From our perspective, we've always been very careful.
And finally on the programme, the discovery of a royal warship which sank off the east coast of Britain in 1682 while carrying a future King of England has been unveiled on Friday after being kept secret for 15 years to protect it from plunderers. 340 years ago, King James II, known as the Duke of York at the time, managed to narrowly escape his sinking ship named the Gloucester. He became king 3 years later. Its final location was a mystery until it was discovered by diving brothers Julian and Lincoln Barnell in 2007 after a 4-year search.
I picked up our encyclopedia of shipwrecks one evening, flicking through, going back to the oldest date I could find, and that was 1682 Gloucester. And I just read the paragraph about the wreck, and the Duke of York was on board, future king, and there was cannon. So that was the big thing for me, if I'm honest. And I knew. So I picked the phone up that night, rang up my brother Julian. I knew what he'd say, and I said, "Are you up for a new adventure?" And go looking for the Gloucester, sank in 1682. Cannon everywhere potentially, and he was just in there like a flash, and off we went. Done my descent to the seabed. About 3/4 of the way down, I could see dark shadow on the seabed, so you know you're on some wreck, which is just really fantastic, obviously. And before you knew it, another 5 meters or so, I was kneeling on the seabed and surrounded by just fantastically huge cannon, and there was more than one. There was a group of them, and I just knelt there, took the moment in for probably 5 minutes, and just unbelievable. Just one I'll never forget. There's quite high expectations about the stern area. There's a 3-meter mound on the seabed, and it could well be some beautiful ornate wood from what we call the stern castle. And from how I believe is back in the day, it was covered in gold leaf, and it can be preserved so well underneath the sand. There's very exciting potential find there.
Now it's a shipwreck. What a discovery. That's it on the programme. Thank you for watching. I'm Millicent Walker. Have a good evening. I'll see you later.